in the wake of the coups that, of course, have taken place across the continent. There have been many reactions and, of course, many calls for better things to be done to protect democracy on the continent. But, of course, we're going to be getting into that this morning. Nigeria's foremost lawyer and human rights activist, Femi Falana, has requested or asked that ECOWAS place a 2-term limit on member states.
And this move has, of course, been criticized by a number of countries. In 2015, we saw a criticism of this as well. And we would understand why this will be thoroughly criticized, because a number of leaders, for their own interests and their desire to run for a third term in office, will be totally opposed to the 2 terms in office. Some of the arguments that they have pushed forward for some of the leaders would be the fact that it's not enough time to be able to begin and complete a number of the projects and number of the work that they've started to do in government. But then, what then is the essence of continuity of government? You start, somebody picks up from where you've left off.
Yeah, but I think anybody who doesn't, achieve anything sizable in 8 to 10 years is not a serious
never do it in 12 years.
You will never do it in 20 years either. Anyway, we're speaking this morning with Dr. Coup Ajiman-Budu, who's the Dean, Faculty of Law, Ghana, Institute of Management and Public Administration. Good morning, Doctor. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Great to have you join us. Femi Falana, of course, requesting that ECOWAS place a 2-term limit. Do you agree with him, or do you think that, that may not be the answer to what we're dealing with concerning the coups in Africa?
Good morning, guys, and thank you for having me this morning. Good morning to all your viewers as well. I think the conversation is long overdue. This is not the first time there has been a call for a term limit, in particular a 2-term limit to presidential terms in West Africa, for instance. As far back as the early 2000s, this was a conversation that was on the table. It's been discussed within the context of ECOWAS. It's been discussed within the context of the AU. And so it's not out of place for this call to be made. If you would recall, in 2021 December, I believe, there was the Kofi Annan Forum, which was held in Accra, where delegates called for, and leaders of some African countries and other leading entities called for presidential term limits. Our own president, the president of Ghana, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo, who gave the keynote address at that event, suggested that the marriage between the electorate and the elected becomes forced once there are no term limits or unconstitutional term limits are imposed. And so it's something that was worrying, and he pledged to rally not just himself, but other African and West African leaders to follow suit and exit office if they are able to do 2 terms. Unfortunately, that's what we're seeing across the continent, in particular in the West African sub-region, where some leaders have purportedly been elected through democratic means or manipulated their constitutions in such that term limits are only just it's just cosmetic, and so it's problematic, as we can see. And there is a direct correlation between sometimes between the coup d'etat that we're seeing and the extension of term limits by some of these leaders as well. So it is not out of place for this call to be made at this particular point in time. It's something that we've been talking about and probably continue talking about, so long as the fundamental structures that are in place in most or some of these West African countries continue to remain the same.
All right. Now, it's one thing to make the call, it's another thing for this call to be adopted. We've seen that there have been countries that have opposed it. In 2015, Togo opposed this. In 2022, Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. What is the possibility that this suggestion will be accepted and adopted by ECOWAS?
It's going to be a long time. Of course, Togo will oppose it. Of course, Cote d'Ivoire will oppose it. Of course, Senegal will oppose it. Looking at those people who were in power at that particular point in time and the things that they did themselves. If you go back, for instance, Togo, for instance, even though you can't say that Faure Singbe came into power through a coup d'état, more or less, it was an institutional coup after his father died in 2005. They were forced to install him as president, and then subsequently he won an election. There were protests, violence led to killing of about 1,000 people and things of that sort. Senegal, they wanted to extend the term limit or the term of the president. Cote d'Ivoire faced the same thing as well, Alassane Ouattara and all that. So of course they will oppose this, and of course there will be opposition for so long as ECOWAS itself allows some of these people who come into power through unconstitutional means or extend their terms beyond the limit prescribed by their constitutions. There's always going to be that opposition, especially when some of these same people end up being elected or being selected to chair the organization itself. I mean, it's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense for us to say that, yes, in principle, we are opposed to unconstitutional overthrows of government and unconstitutional extension of term limits. But then we turn around and let these same people be the ones in charge of the movement towards preventing term limits. Of course, it's not going to work out, because they're looking out for their own interests. If you look at the example of Guinea, for instance, and this cuts across many African countries as well, they had the Secretary served for about 25 years. What's his name? Is it the one that came after him also served about 24 years or so. And then the new leader who came into power, whom many expected to break or had broken that chain of long-term serving presidents, came into power, and then what did he do? At the end of his term, he decided to also extend his term, and went for an election, won, but a year later he was deposed through a coup d'état. And so there's a fundamental connection between these extension of term limits or persons being allowed to control power for so long, and some of these coup d'états that we're seeing across the sub region. Remember, we're coming from an era where between 1961 and 1997 there were about 71 coup d'etats or something of that sort within Africa as a whole, and mostly focused in the West African sub-region, which used to be referred to as the Coup Belt anyway. So of course there will be opposition, and I don't see a resolution to this issue unless the tough questions are asked and the people themselves or the leaders themselves who are at the forefront of the sub-region look at themselves and tell themselves the hard truth that there's no business you being there when you have served more than a certain number of times, and you yourself have manipulated your constitution in your country and essentially legitimized yourself as the leader, and then you're calling on other people to have term limits. Of course, it's not going to work.
All right, but I mean, it's interesting because ECOWAS has sat by while these things have happened. ECOWAS has sat, by while there have been, seemingly very fraudulent elections in these countries, that had international observers or no international, they didn't even matter. These persons have, enforced themselves or fought themselves on the people, with these type of elections. But I want to talk about, while they are not being honest, like you've described, what do you think must be done to fix the failing democracy across Africa? There's been arguments that maybe, democracy is not right, or the continent is not ripe for democracy. But, I'm sure that there's people who say that we are ripe. It's just, the people themselves that keep making it fail. So what do you think should be done to fix that aspect, the part where democracy continues to fail across the continent?
I don't think democracy is not right for the continent, or Africa is not right for democracy. As a matter of fact, an Afrobarometer report recently suggested that about 81% of West African voters prefer democracy as the main form of governance system in the sub-region. The problem, as I see it, is a failure of leadership, and the fact that our leaders have not been forthright with us. And but we can't just blame the leaders as well. We need to, at a point, look at ourselves as well, because guess where we get these leaders from? These leaders come from amongst us. And so when they get there, it's a reflection of we the people. So I think that one way of looking at it is we the people need to call for accountability, and we need to hold our leaders to account, as opposed to what we're seeing in our contemporary times, where people just rise to leadership positions and manipulate office and stay in for so long as they desire. See what just happened in Gabon. And recently in the West African sub-region as well. We've seen Guinea, we've seen Mali, we've seen Burkina Faso, and so on and so forth. I think it's about time that we, the people, stand up to our leaders and ensure that the right thing is done. And if we don't do that, we're going to have this vicious cycle of unconstitutional extensions of terms, and we're going to see more and more some of these coup d'etats happening, and some military adventurers taking advantage of that situation to ensure that they overthrow the government. It's just a vicious cycle.
Apologies for jumping in.
Till we get to the
kindly hold on. The challenge with that is, kindly hold on. The challenge with that is, yes, I get, how it sounds, that we need to stand up to our government and all of that. But, the challenge with that is most times these governments, use brute force to silence these oppositions. I don't think anybody wants to see an Arab Spring look-alike again across the continent. So these people are brutalized and forced into silence, and somehow, some way. ECOWAS looks away, the African Union looks the other way, the rest of the world looks away, while, dozens of Africans are killed for daring to challenge or stand up to their government. So, that doesn't work.
So then what's the alternative? We just sit by and fold our arms, and then why do we complain then? Why are we having this conversation in the first place? If nobody's advocating for violence or suggesting that people should put themselves out in a way that they will end up being brutalized. But what's the alternative? Nothing good has come easy, or nothing good comes on a silver platter, if I can put it that way. So there has to be something. Clearly, the solutions that we're preferring, that has been preferred in the past by ECOWAS and the African Union, have not worked, simply because there's the lack of the political will, simply because these leaders who are supposed to take these decisions, a majority of them or some of them are sitting there, and they themselves have no business being there. They shouldn't. Either they came through coup d'etat and have legitimized themselves one way or the other, and they've been accepted as such. One way of looking at it is we should prevent persons who come into power through constitutional overthrow of governments from even becoming leaders of these regions. Imagine someone who overthrows a constitutionally elected government, styles himself as a Democrat because elections are held, and he legitimizes himself, and all of a sudden everybody just looks away as if that person is a saint and is elected or selected as the head of an organization that is supposed to prevent the same thing that brought this person into power. So until we stop deluding ourselves and stop kidding ourselves that there's going to be an internal solution or a solution at that level, and we don't take responsibility ourselves, we're going to be having these conversations over and over and over again. And guess what's going to happen? Absolutely nothing, because the political elite and those who rise to those positions are in there thinking of their own interest, and not necessarily sometimes the interest of the people at large. So something has to give.
Absolutely.
What it is, I do not know. I'm just preferring thinking out aloud and suggesting that we take a more proactive stance. But honestly, I don't know what's going to happen.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to put a pause, to the conversation here. Obviously, it's a never-ending conversation, and more and more, persons and more perspectives need to also be brought in. But we appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much for speaking with us. And we, of course, continue to do what we must do to ensure that governance is better across the continent. We'll speak with you again.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.